You are watching Interviews of Ethos. Ethos is part of the Medical Ethics and Humanities Unit at Lee Ka-shing Faculty of Medicine in Hong Kong. We publish works in medicine, ethics, law, and humanities. I'm Leo Lee, an editor at Ethos, and the following conversation is with Professor Jens Scherpe, a professor of comparative law at Aalborg University and founding director of the Nordic Centre for Comparative International Family Law. He was formerly the Chung Yitung Visiting Professor at the University of Hong Kong and has been authority on international family law since. Professor, how has the study of family law changed over the past 20 years?
Oh, well, so I always start by saying that the point of family law is not to be the general law.
Yeah.
So we have family law because general law is not good enough to regulate interhuman relationships, because when we're in love, we do stupid things, and that's actually good in many ways. So you're not negotiating at arm's length. So therefore, contract law, tort law, the general law is just not set up for that kind of human relationship. And therefore, we have family law. So the underlying idea of family law, like for example, consumer law or labor law, is that you have a power imbalance sometimes in the relationships, and that therefore there needs to be a bit of a protective scope to see that not one party is taking unfair advantage of the other and so on. But of course, family law also has a sort of a wider societal function where there's certain behaviors that we would like to promote. For example, paying maintenance for your children, just saying, and so on. So I think, and that's where we situate family law. And for comparative family law, I always laugh because family law is sort of a discipline that many colleagues don't appreciate very highly, to put it tactfully, because it's all about feeling and fluffy and so on. And then they very much say the same about comparative law, where it's all about comparing cultures and identities and traditions and so on. So, and I combine the two, that basically the two disciplines that many of my colleagues look down on, and then you have comparative family law on top of that. But the interesting thing about comparative law, and particularly comparative family law, is that of course certain societal developments happen at relatively similar times in different parts of the world, and then we can see how they are reacted to and why, and then learn from what have other people have done or not done, and see the consequences of that. But the importance, of course, is that every society is unique, every culture is different, and you can't just say, oh, Sweden did this, therefore Somalia must do that. It just doesn't work like this. So that's cultural imperialism. So that's not how comparative law works. So the idea is that you study what other countries have done, why they have done it, which social issues they wanted to address, were they successful, and if so, why? And then you can ask yourself, do you want to address this in your own society? And can we be inspired by what other people have done? Can this give us ideas? And then we take these ideas and see whether they can work. So the technical construct is very often called a transplant. And that's actually quite a good word, because we need to be very careful with transplants, just like in medicine, because there's blood groups and there's antibodies and there's blood vessels that need to be connected, and they may be different from human being to human being, and so it is different from legal culture to legal culture. You just can't take same-sex marriage in Sweden and say that's great for Saudi Arabia. It doesn't work like that. So, and of course, the beauty of family law is that everyone in some shape or form, even if you were a foundling, has a family and they will leave something behind, whereas not every one of us is a bank. So it's actually relevant for everyone. And I find that students can actually relate quite well to family law very often, because they know someone, or their parents are this, or they have a brother and therefore their relationship to them and so on. So whereas, as I say, not everyone is a bank and doing mergers and acquisitions and so on, which of course are real, very important law topics. But
okay, it's very interesting you talk about feelings and the idea of people relating to the idea of family law. I was just wondering, how do you see the institution or the concept of marriage evolving in the next decade or so?
Well, if you just look at how it's evolved over the years, it's interesting because people very often say marriage has always been.
Yeah.
And even in this region, people say marriage has always been. But if you actually look at just how marriage has changed, particularly in this area, and what traditional marriage was like, it's actually quite different from how we define marriage today. And also, I mean, in most of the Western jurisdictions, marriage follows the Christian tradition, which originally did not permit divorce. Yet all European jurisdictions and all Northern American, Southern American jurisdictions now have divorce. And then you couldn't marry your deceased brother's wife, or you couldn't, and so, or a black person couldn't marry a white person, a Jew couldn't marry a Christian. So all of that has been changing. And so my bottom line, which, I'm giving away the grand finale of my teaching, so I apologize to my future students. But to me, marriage in modern times, in legal terms, is actually nothing but a registered partnership. So it's this legal framework that we offer people to sign up to or opt for, and then get a protective legal framework. Now, we happen to call this marriage, because that's the way we traditionally perceive relationships. But ultimately, it's just a legal frame. And so we can do it differently. You can remarry. You can marry a Jew, or you can marry a man or a woman. And maybe in the future, you can marry both at the same time. So because it is a legal framework, it is really up for each individual society to decide what their marriage is going to be like, how difficult or easy it will be to divorce, whether you're allowed to remarry and how quickly. And so I'm fairly agnostic to the concept of marriage, because that's really for each individual society to determine. So marriage as an institution has been changing quite a bit. I mean, particularly more in Western jurisdictions, although also Asian jurisdictions are beginning to change as well, with Thailand, for example, and others. So we'll see how it goes. But I mean, it has changed quite noticeably already.
Right.
So I don't see why that should not continue. So I mean but I mean, people seem to be very focused on this institution of marriage in their discussions, mainly because it embodies many values for many people, and it is a religious concept as well. And there's very often a conflation between the legal and the religious concept, of course, because I mean, my favorite example, and I apologize to my wife because now this will be recorded, but so as a reasonably rational lawyer, when we were going to get married, we could potentially, as an alternative, also have entered into a registered partnership. So I was asking myself, which one of the two would I prefer? Because the legal consequences in many countries would be the exact same. Is exact same. And even though I consider myself a very rational lawyer, family lawyer on top of everything else, I actually like to be married rather than just in a registered partnership, right? So there is something to marriage that is perhaps a bit special, but I think that's the social connotations rather than the legal. And we also need to respect that, because a marriage means a lot to a lot of people. But ultimately, what the state provides is a legal framework. So there were suggestions in some countries that we should abolish marriage as a legal institution and leave registered partnership as the way to formalize a relationship between two people, and leave marriage to the social and religious sphere, which then, depending on how it's constructed, would trigger these consequences. Because a Muslim marriage is not a Christian marriage, it's not a Jewish marriage, or a Taoist marriage. I mean, they're very different, but it all means something to us. And I think in order to be inclusive and allow all of us to live in the same society, we should ideally have a concept of marriage that embodies what most people or all people can identify themselves with. So I think there's going to be changes afoot, and they've always been. I mean, women used to be the property of the man. That was what marriage was about. Through marriage, man and woman become one, which is governed by the man. We've changed that. I would argue this is a good thing, and other things will change as well.
Yeah, very interesting. You talk about the differences between the social connotation of marriage and the legal framework that it is. Do you think currently in our legal framework we should adopt more of a social connotation, or, like, elaborating from what you just said, normatively we should split these two, concepts apart?
I mean, it's from the state's perspective, it is what are we trying to achieve by providing regulation? Again, that's part of my teaching. Apologies to my future students. But so, I mean, you need to ask ourselves, why are we actually offering this legal framework? What is the purpose? Is it to provide a safe legal framework for the raising of children? If so, why are we not making the existence of children a precondition for the legal framework to apply?
Right.
Rather than somebody saying, I do, right? Or is it because by making this commitment to each other, we stand in for each other in good times and in bad times, to quote one particular religious text. And so it's the solidarity between the partners that we want to support. But if we do that, then perhaps the relationship that we're looking at should reflect this solidarity. And does it really depend on the gender of the parties or whether they have a sexual relationship? So, for example, if I take care of my elderly mother for a decade because she's got dementia, maybe that kind of relationship is worth recognizing as well.
Right.
And we don't have to call this marriage, of course, but we may want to provide a legal framework. So I think we are now at the stage where it's the traditional family where everyone sort of got married and it was all between a man and a woman and we all stayed in the same household and there were several generations. We don't live like that anymore in most parts of the world, or certainly the Western world. And so maybe we need to adapt to these social situations. And we've got plenty of cases. There's a case of Burden and Burden from the United Kingdom where two sisters lived together for a very long time and they had all these elements of solidarity, but of course no intent to procreate or even have a conjugal relationship, because that's not what that was about. And then we have plenty of people who have conjugal relationships with no intention of having an intense legal relationship. I mean, it's changing. So I think we need to be open-minded about what it is that we want to achieve, what is it that we want to protect, and then tailor-make the legal frameworks accordingly.
Absolutely. Speaking of the role of the law in this way, then, do you think perhaps family law or maybe law in general, drives social change, or is merely a reflection of social change?
Yeah, that's the eternal question. So, when I teach this, then it's usually between the two poles of protection on the one hand, and then and a certain autonomy on the other. And so one is rather paternalistic, and the other one is recognizing the freedom of the individual. And it's always somewhere in between, I think, for the most part. So John Ekeler, the great John Ekeler, who I was lucky enough to study with, he's written about this and called this regularization and regulation. So one concept is to regularize things that are already there. So you just take up social trends and so on. And then there's regulation where you say, this is what we want. So it's always between the two poles. So we can have a political agenda and decide this is what we want. And then you can drive things in that way. So if we say no parking on double yellow lines, then we have a very clear legal intent there. We don't want you to park there. On the other hand, if we realize that people are parking in certain spaces because they really have to and so on, then we might start thinking about maybe we should allow them to park there. And silly examples, of course. But so I think family law has elements of both. But family also is, of course, about protecting the vulnerable. So I do know that particularly in this part of the world, but also generally in law, and I do think that generally that is a good thing, that we're looking for consensus and see what the majority agrees to. But then the majority will never agree to higher taxes. Yeah. So sometimes the whole point is to protect people who are in a minority as well, and to offer them the ability to live in a normal way,
right?
And to be accepted as who they are. So, for example, for a long time, people who were divorced were shunned by society, right? And so, or women in particular, of course, or you couldn't get divorced, and when you had marital difficulties, well, that was your own problem. So, of course, in some very few jurisdictions on the planet, that's still the case. So it's always an element of both, and we need to be careful not to fall to the extremes. But there's also the other thing that we don't need to follow every social trend and do it immediately.
Absolutely.
Just because one TikToker said so, we don't need new law. Family law is a delicate balancing act. But we do have pronouncements, and also here in Hong Kong, we have very clear decisions by the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal, which says, this needs to happen, because the basic law says so. And I think we ought to respect, of course, these decisions, even if perhaps it goes against what the majority may think. We don't know quite what the majority thinks, but even so, I'm very much a live and let live person. So if
Right.
certain people want to live in a way. I mean, I could not possibly imagine myself living like that, but who am I to argue, right?
That's very true. That's very true. Then perhaps we can move into some personal particulars then in that matter. Speaking of how, you understand different perspectives in family law, and just wondering, did that perhaps inspire you to go into family law as a specialism, or is there other intrinsic values?
I mean, ironically, my first PhD was on consumer law.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it did have the element of, the imbalance of power, but that is probably just a coincidence. Now, when I was working at the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, the German government wanted the institute to do comparative investigation on same-sex relationships. And I so happened to be the available assistant at the time.
Right.
And so I got into this project and therefore started working with this. And I found it's really interesting because it combines so many things. I mean, I've said already that many of my colleagues look down upon family law, but actually, as a family lawyer, you need to know your contract law. You need to know your trust law. You need to know your company law. You need to know your tax law. You need to know your social law. So it's actually, you need to be quite versatile in order to able to navigate all the fields that family law spans. So in my center, Northam, we think that tax law can be family law. If like for example in Germany, if you're married, you get significant tax incentives, but only if one of you earns a lot more than the other.
Right.
And that is a bit of a social engineering project, of course, because it means that it encourages a specific way of living, which most of the time is very gendered. Yeah. And so, I mean, we can use lots of areas to manipulate law, and I found this fascinating. And I never really left family law since then. So we did this first one, and then it became my comparative law area, and worked off kind of right. It got me here. So.
That's very true. You are the authority for family law.
Well, yeah, some people might dispute that, including myself, but there we are.
Well, also, seeing that you're also formerly a Cheng Yuteng professor at HKU, and that you've held provisions in Cambridge, obviously, in Spain, Austria, etc. I was just wondering, also even assisting in family law cases, even in Hong Kong, right? So I was just wondering, could you share your experience working in these jurisdictions, and what's the greatest difference working in these faculties?
I mean, it's the different understandings of what family is and what family should do, which is different from culture to culture. Although I think the difference is greater between generations than it is between cultures, funny enough. So one of the things I do in my course is that we discuss how money should be divided, matrimonial finance in case of divorce. And it's quite interesting to see that there's a massive difference between the way younger and older people think about their relationships. So there's a much greater desire, particularly by young professionals, which most of the lawyers are dreaming of being, so to have greater independence and so on. Whereas, people who have lived a bit longer and have seen a bit more seem to think about this in a very different way. Because life doesn't always work in the way we want to. And then there's this power imbalance, which family law is, of course, supposed to address. So I found it fascinating that even across jurisdictions, and I'm teaching online next week in Uruguay, and I've been down to New Zealand and so on. So but even though the cultures are very different, and even here on Hong Kong, there is a difference between students who are local and come from the mainland in the way they engage with the law. And for me, that's fascinating. So I really love going somewhere else to teach, because I know what I'm going to say. That's a bit boring for me, but the interaction is what really makes it worthwhile. And it's quite different. And also the individuals are quite different. And then, of course, there's different faiths, very often underlying things. So, I mean, it's because family law very much is also a culture study in many ways. So I do find that fascinating. So I'm enjoying my subject, perhaps a bit too much, as you can tell.
Very rare, people have the privilege of enjoying the profession, especially in law, these days.
Could not possibly comment.
But yeah, especially on teaching, maybe. Perhaps can you tell us about your teaching philosophy and what drives you to teach different cultures?
Yeah, the funny thing is I was a professor at Cambridge for a long time. And these are supposed to be the best and the brightest. I'll leave it like that. But, I mean, but irrespective of where you teach, there's very often the expectation that when they come to study law, they are learning the law.
Yeah.
That's not the point of studying the law. The point of studying law is to learn legal thinking. Because the law changes, the cases change. So if you know the law, that won't help you very much along the way. So what I'm trying to do is to teach legal thinking. And it doesn't really matter very much which subject you use for that. I personally think that family law is particularly good for that because it straddles so many areas, and very often there's discretionary rules where you then really need to work on your argumentative skills. But it really doesn't matter so much, because ultimately when you get a law degree, you don't walk out with a set of knowledge in tort law that you will apply throughout your life, because there may be a case next week that's different. And so my philosophy is to teach you legal thinking. And that, of course, implies that I don't teach you what to think, but how to think. So I've given first-class marks for papers where I fundamentally disagreed with the outcome and the policy behind it. But that's not my job. So my job was to, get people engaged with the subject and see the different sides, and then decide for themselves, with good reasoning, why they prefer one over the other. Because, as you know, laws very often, could go either way ultimately, and then it's a policy decision. So my teaching philosophy is letting people think rather than do it frontal and then just this is what they have to do. So and that also seems to be much more enjoyable, because I said I know what I think, and I find that pretty boring after a while. So it's much more interesting to engage students. Students always ask me, so what do you expect of a student? I always say, be interested and interesting. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Do something, and it doesn't have to be the law, just, and taste real life. So one of my old professors always said, you will learn more working over the summer on the construction site than you will learn in 1 year in law school about the things that matter in life. And when I was young, I thought that was a bit silly, but the older I get, there's something to it. Because law ultimately is about life.
That's very good saying, yeah.
Yeah.
It is, especially, family law is
Yes.
institution of life sometimes, you can put it that way.
Yes, yeah, sometimes, of course, also death, but yeah. yeah, but it's you can also tell when things go wrong for people in their family, how much it impacts their entire life. And this is why when you're a practicing family lawyer, you are so much more than just a lawyer, because you're actually helping people to move forward in their lives where they're in a corner and they don't feel they can maneuver their life on, or they can't see their children anymore, or they're stuck in a relationship that doesn't work and they want to sort of go separate ways, but it's difficult to do that, and then there's money and the children. So a lawyer, family lawyer, is in that situation is also a therapist and sometimes a punching ball, and so it requires many more skills than some other areas of law that I shall not name.
Right. I'm going to probe into that a little bit. Perhaps, what do you find most rewarding about your job as a family lawyer?
Just one silly example. So, because I've been teaching here for quite a bit, and then I was just standing here, and then somebody walks in. I go, I do remember you. So it was one of my former students from HKU who just saw that I was here on a social media post, and then thought, oh, he should pop in and have a look. And there he was. And so, so people remember you, and that means you must have done something that made you memorable. And I hope that's a good thing. He did come up here. So, for me, and this may sound a bit arrogant, but I'm a full professor. I don't academically and promotion-wise, I don't have anywhere to go. So from when that happened to me, actually it was at Cambridge, I decided from now on it's not about me anymore. So I don't need to write another book. But what I want to do, and actually that's been what I've been wanting to do my entire teaching career, is to get others to some places. And it doesn't have to be my place, and they can go very, very different places, but to get them thinking and get them thinking about their own affairs and their lives and what they want to do. And if they end up in corporate law, so be it. Yeah,
Right.
and most of them do, of course. But the greatest blessing really is to see that young people, that I taught do remember down the line. So if you're watching this, send me a Christmas card. That really makes me, appreciate my job even more. If people say, I disagreed with everything, and whatever you taught me did not help me in any way in my career, but I do remember you. Merry Christmas. That's all that's required.
That's a very interesting answer, I would have to say. And it's very inspiring that sometimes there's professors who genuinely care about student development. And isn't that the point of having a research-based institution these days, right?
One would think.
Yeah. Perhaps we can move on then, to the idea of students, and especially students in law school. Yeah. Do you perhaps have any advice for any upcoming academics or students who want to perhaps specialize in family law?
Yeah, there's a difference between wanting to study law and wanting to become an academic. And it's not necessarily that people choose one path or the other are particularly suited for it. But I think, my key advice for students in law school is not to choose the subjects that you think are going to be useful.
Right.
But choose the subjects that you think are interesting. Because ultimately, your corporate law firm will not say, oh, we couldn't give you a training contract because you chose legal history. But you will learn skills, you will learn things, you will enjoy it much more if it actually interests you, and you can always catch up on the corporate law. And that's true for all the subjects. And you will be better at what you do when you're actually enjoying it. So I see many of my students who go, well, I need to commercial corporate law because that's the career that I want to have. Okay, that's the decision you've taken. I'm not sure on which basis most students take this, probably because they think of their future bank accounts. And fair enough, we all need to live, that's okay. But they then very often think that they have to tick certain boxes. And there are some boxes that you need to tick, but the main box is you need to be good at what you do. And chances of you being good at what you do are much higher if you're enjoying it.
Right.
So my advice would be, my best study experience was when I already had a PhD, and then I went back to do a master's degree in Oxford, which is a bit weird, but I had the opportunity, so why not? Yeah. And so I studied for a very different reason. I did not study for a degree. I studied because I wanted to know stuff. And that really transformed my own study experience, and I think it might have changed my teaching as well, because I was really just interested in understanding things and putting them together rather than making sure that I had a good mark. I'm sure I annoyed the hell out of my teachers, but it's a very different way of engaging, and it was much more enjoyable than my previous law studies, I must say. It may have been Oxford, don't tell Cambridge, but I know there's not that much between them. But so I would just pick things that you want to do. This is my recommendation.
Yeah.
And if it's academia, great. If so, if you want to steer down the academic path, I would seize opportunities to write a thesis so that you can get a feel for what it is to write, because writing a research paper is very different from writing an exam.
Right.
So that I think is it's a good way to test yourself as well. Other than that, enjoy your studies. There's plenty of work life afterwards. So, and if you can afford the time and the money to do a master's degree, it's more time spent in an academic institution and not working. Yeah. So he says, having spent too much time in academic institutions, but it's enjoy the privilege that you're allowed to study.
Yeah, very interesting. You talk about differences between someone in academia and someone who goes into as a lawyer. Do you think there's any distinctive qualities that would set aside a student who would much more beneficial for them to pursue one particular career over another?
Mostly it's a personality thing, and also if you're willing to make the financial sacrifice of going into academia. At the very beginning of my career, I had the choice between a 35,000 euros teaching job or 135,000 euros job at a law firm, and I chose one over the other. But that's, of course, a question of personal preference. I don't think there's necessarily any qualities. but there's nothing wrong with being a corporate lawyer, and it is a very interesting area of law, at least once you've passed the initial hurdles where you only get to do the sort of basic stuff. So, I mean, I think what we would like to see as human beings in our lives is a job that's not just a job where you tick the boxes and do the hours, but something that you find challenging, but manageable, ideally, but challenging, and also interesting. And you can find that in any job, but I think we need to listen more to ourselves and to see what we ourselves find interesting. And I see this with many students, not necessarily here because I'm not this clued into the local communities of it, but more particularly at Cambridge, where there's this idea that I've now had the opportunity to come to Cambridge, and therefore I must do this and this and this, and it has to be a magic circle firm and so on. And it's not the right thing for everyone. And also, I always say, for example, for me, family is more important than family law. So my priority was to be able to be there for my children. And that is also a reason why I did not choose a judicial career or a career in a big law firm, because there's other demands. I mean, as my wife will confirm, there's many hours to be worked as a family law academic, and I probably do more than I should. But still, I mean, it's a question of personal priorities as well. And there's nothing wrong with trying to do one or the other, but actually one needs to be open-minded enough and willing to actually realize that maybe this is not what makes me happy in the long run. And I see many people persevering in careers, particularly because the income is so good. And of course, once you're an associate and then there's the next step, I mean, it's a bit like one of those slightly addictive games. I mean, there's an incentive structure built in that will keep you in certain jobs, and it's not that different in academia. Once you've got tenure, why would you give that up, and so on. But we shouldn't be shy about re-evaluating your life choices. So I have a very good friend and colleague who was, the top in her profession, academically speaking, and wonderful colleague, fantastic human being, outstanding academic, I mean, world leading, and then she decided that does not make her happy, and she now does something completely different. And I have the greatest respect for that decision. And frankly, I've never seen her happier in my life. I mean, to have the strength and the courage to reevaluate what we do every once in a while is actually quite helpful. I mean, for me, that was the moment when I reached the top of my profession, where I'd really worked hard to become that professor. And I thought, no, now fine, now what? And it did change the way I wanted to do things. So, I mean, I can only encourage people to think about their life choices. And there's nothing wrong with getting the training that this provides or that provides, because there's always some benefit that you get from this. But ultimately, we have a limited time on this planet. And for me, that was, that limited time ideally is shared with my children and my family and my friends, and not necessarily with me sitting in a suit staring at the screen all the time.
Absolutely.
But that's my life choice, right?
Well, yeah. Well, to probe more into perhaps your life choices, have there been a point in your career that you've looked back and perhaps reevaluated your position, and perhaps have felt any sort of regret or concern about what you could have done differently to get here?
I mean, I have a dark past. I did work for Deutsche Bank. So I did an apprenticeship in the bank and then worked for 3 years there. And then I reevaluated my life and said, this is not what I want to do all my life. And then I went to university, which at that point I could afford because I had worked in the bank. But I mean, I regret, I don't think so. I mean, yes, there's always life choices where you think, oh, I should have done this differently, or I shouldn't have said that.
Absolutely.
But in the grand scheme of things, I am where I am also because of the bad choices I've taken, right? And I mean, there were also bad career choices, undoubtedly, but ultimately I am where I am. So I really have no reason to complain. I'm very privileged to be able to do what I do. So there's no regret. I mean, there's little instances where you think, yeah, I could have been nicer there, or I should have been, not so nice in that situation. I mean, but in the grand personal decisions, I'm a very happy man. So no,
that's amazing.
I'm very lucky. Yeah.
I'm inspired by that, honestly. Yeah. it's quite frankly, it's a very rare case, especially perhaps in Chinese societies where we can be genuinely proud of or genuinely enjoying one's own career with so much emphasis on, carrying the family, being the breadwinner and all that. So it's very fascinating that.
Well, the jury's out on who's the breadwinner in our family. But,
yeah.
And who's the housemaker.
I mean, for both even, right? Like, men or women, husband or wife, or husband, wife. It's perfectly fine.
Yeah. And I have 2 glorious children, and it's a good life.
It's great. So I'm gonna move on a little bit to perhaps, I don't want to bore you with the past 2 days of surrogacy, but I understand this is still a medical law-ish interview. So I do want to go into, the idea of criminalizing surrogacy or legitimizing surrogacy. So I've kind of read your work on comparative perspective of surrogacy. Not that much of it, but I tried my best to understand your arguments. And you wrote that even a prohibited or a tolerant approach would create like international implications on surrogacy, where people would just do the practice elsewhere, right? But then at the same time, it's also clear from your writing that there isn't a definitive solution to how we can solve surrogacy, or perhaps make surrogacy available. But then, do you think it's truly viable for countries to maintain this sort of closed policy for surrogacy, given that other their citizens can just seek surrogacy elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think the case that shows this the best is the recent decision of the European Court of Human Rights in KK in Denmark, where Denmark basically prohibits surrogacy. It's because it commodifies women, it encourages trafficking of children, so basically Denmark doesn't want that.
Absolutely.
But if no payments are being made, then it's so-called altruistic surrogacy, and we could have another interview just about this specific term, then that's okay, and then that can happen. So the way the mechanism is in most countries that are not actively engaged in legislating on surrogacy is that it's not possible in your own country, so you go somewhere else, and then you come home with your child, and then you want this child to be legally recognized as your child, because at that point in time, that hasn't happened. So, and the problem is that if money was paid, many jurisdictions, including this one, in principle, although in practice it's very different, will say, but then that's not possible. But there's a fallacy behind this, because who are the parents of the child?
Right.
Now, in the example from Denmark, the sperm of the man was used, so he's the father of the child. And then it's actually unclear whether the egg of the woman, the ova, was used of the woman, because it actually doesn't matter, because the mother is the woman who gave birth. Now, and according to Danish law, before the KK decision, and that's very true for many countries, and I'm not just using this case because I'm from Denmark, because it's one of the recent decisions. The answer was, but you paid money, and therefore we will not allow the adoption, because that's commodification.
Right.
And so but the underlying premise is that this will deter people from doing this, because this will, you will never be the mother of the child. But the child could live with them. She would get parent responsibility and custody, but she would never be the legal mother of the child. And so, the European Court of Human Rights said this is a violation of the child's rights, because it actually puts the child as a disadvantage. So, but leaving that to one side, the underlying premise of this prohibition is that we really do not want financial payments to be made. And therefore, we're having this law, and this deters people. Now, my problem with this is that it actually doesn't deter people.
Right.
So, suppose you are in a relationship. So let's say, I'm married or not, doesn't matter. It could be you, but it could also be, let's make it more traditional. It's a woman, and we have a fertility problem. The two of us would also have a fertility problem. But let's just say that. And then I say, but we would like to start a family. Now, if we were both trained lawyers, and we actually knew what we were doing, and we would do it despite the situation in Denmark being what it is. So we would go abroad, we would have a child through surrogacy, we would then return, because it's my child. I call it sperm always wins, because I'm the father of the child. So, and yes, my partner, you or the woman, the imaginative woman sitting next to me, you would never be the legal parents of the child.
Right.
But we would still be a family. We would still have a child. I would still have a child. And assuming you or the woman are in love with me and we want to be a family, would that deter us? It doesn't deter people. We see case after case after case where people in prohibitive countries or tolerant countries which Hong Kong ranks as 1 because in principle you can do it unless payments are being made, and then anyway, so ultimately that happens. So people do it anyway. So the only result we see as part of a prohibition or only tolerating certain types of surrogacy is A, they happen anyway, and the person being disadvantaged for most situations is the woman, because the man get what they want, because I am the father, because my sperm was used, the sperm always wins, and the child is disadvantaged, because the child does not have inheritance rights from the other parent. And they will live with the other person, and they will be like a parent in every sense of the word, but they will not be the parent. And that's the essence of the court decision, is that being like a parent is not being a parent. And while you could say the adult people have deliberately circumvented the law, fair enough, the child didn't. So, and this is why the decisions in virtually every country in the world ultimately put the best interest of the child at the center, because it's not the child's fault that it was brought about in this particular way. Why would you deny the child inheritance rights? Why would you deny the child the identity of having a parent on a day-to-day basis? This is so important for children. And therefore, we concluded way before the KK decision in the book, but it's just along the same lines, that denying the child this security and safe upbringing that this child deserves just because we disapprove of certain things. And there are good reasons to disapprove of surrogacy. Because there are exploitative practices, there is commodification, there are baby factories. It can be horrible. But of course, we can sit on the moral high horse and saying, but no, we prohibit this in our jurisdiction. But then our citizens go somewhere else. And we can't control where they go, and we can't control what happens in these jurisdictions. So we're exporting our exploitation. So instead of, we have these people who are not deterred, and they won't be because of the way the law works, and they go somewhere else, and then exploitation happens. And commodification happens. Our women are treated like cattle in some of these jurisdictions, and it's not okay. But we're promoting this by not allowing it in our home jurisdictions, because people then have to go elsewhere. So we have an element of gender discrimination, because the man always gets what they want, provided their sperm is good enough. Women do not. And then there's an element of wealth discrimination, because only rich people go somewhere else. I mean, if you want the good treatment, you go to the USA and to Canada, because you get citizenship on top of that, or Turkey and so on. But if you don't have as much money, then you go to Laos or Cambodia, or Kenya maybe, or now Mexico seems to be reasonably. I mean, it's a global market, and we whether we like or dislike the practice, actually it's neither here nor there. It is going to happen, and the question is whether we can justify to ourselves as human beings that the one who is suffering ultimately is the child. And to tell a child, no, you shouldn't have been born, that's probably not so good. But also, coming back to the original part, the criminalization, if we actually stick with the criminalization, and we have seen that in many countries there are certain acts that are criminalized with regard to surrogacy, although it's mostly not the surrogate and the intended parents, it must be said. But where that is, I mean, do you actually taint the child with a stigma of criminalization? Say, yes, we love you so much, Daddy went to prison for 6 months. Yeah, I mean, is that what you want to tell your child?
Yeah.
Because if you ask me, would I go to prison for my child for 6 months? Oh yeah, I would. I mean, I love my children. So, and I because I love my children, I presume that other people would love theirs as well. And we do all sorts of sacrifice for our children, and so people will do it. And the only way to prevent the worst abuses is to make sure that it happens in a regulated environment. And we can't regulate the environment elsewhere. I mean, some jurisdictions, including Hong Kong, of course, are trying by having extraterritoriality in their laws, but that's not working either. I mean, we could name the odd tycoon who comes home with children, and then, that's just the way it is. And again, we can't blame the children. You can't hold the children liable for the way they were brought about. So to me, the future in this area is that we need to engage with it rather than ignore it, and put the children at the center of these decisions.
That's a very insightful argument, I would say. But perhaps elaborating on how we can solve this issue, do you think it's viable for multilateral cooperation? Perhaps, I know you dispute this in your work, but then perhaps focusing on the idea of children at the center, do you think there could be perhaps actually international dialogue in building some sort of treaty?
I mean, the Hague Conference is working on this and has been working on this in a long time. But of course, the problem is the idea that you have a world authority which then says, and this is now the law for everyone, that of course doesn't exist.
Yeah.
That's the stuff of science fiction or horror movies, depending on how you want to define it. But so it's many, many countries. And these countries have very different ideas and perceptions of family, as we know from comparative law. So the idea that you would have the entire world signing up to the same treaty which offers protections in the way that you and I and everyone else agrees should be there, it's not going to happen because we have got different ideas about what should be protected and so on. And it's a massive industry as well. So many jurisdictions, of course, the politicians in these jurisdictions also have to take into account their constituents who say, but we're earning squillions with this. And that's why, as much as we would love to have an international treaty to which all the nations of the world sign up, I mean, not even the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has been signed by everyone.
Right.
And there's nothing offensive about this one in principle, one would think. So it's an illusion to think that we could have a treaty where then everyone signs up. But as soon as you have some countries outside, that means that they won't play by the rules, and this may be that they may then be more attractive destinations for surrogacy tourism again. And so, therefore, the hope that we actually get an international convention which will solve all these problems is just as much an illusion as saying, oh, no, we prohibit it and then it doesn't happen anymore. Because neither seems to work. So we need to engage with that reality and then try to protect as much as we can. I mean, even the best regulation in one nation will not lead to people still going abroad. But I would say that if we manage to protect a significant percentage of people, then that's an aim worth pursuing. And so, no, we won't achieve perfection. But I mean, people who always want to achieve perfection are very unhappy people anyway. But I mean, it's not going to happen that we will have this solution. I mean, that's just not working. But to make things better for more people, I think is an aim that the law can and should pursue. So, and think that's what we should do for surrogacy. I mean, in Hong Kong, you don't even have a single clinic that is licensed to do surrogacy, right? So, and there may be good reasons for that. But that means your citizens have to go elsewhere, and then there's no control.
I mean, even speaking of Hong Kong, right? There's now perhaps evolving cases saying there's a child at common law, and, different protections. Do you think Hong Kong is going in the right direction at this, or perhaps there can be some changes being made?
Yeah. Well, I mean, changes can and should be made. Yeah. I mean, I think most people who work in this area would agree that these changes are necessary. But then, changes in child law have been necessary for a very long time. And I mean, the problem with family law reforms in the broader sense is that they are usually not endearing those in power to the population as a whole, because there will always be critical voices and there will be public dispute. And that's why many politicians shy away from taking strong decisions in these areas. But of course, the Hong Kong model is very much based on the UK model, and the UK model was found to be lacking, and therefore there's now new reform proposals in the UK. There was a government change, who knows what's going to happen. But so I do think there is need for reform, and there's also need for the realization is that Hong Kong citizens who actually have a fertility problem and know it can be resolved in other jurisdictions will avail themselves of these chances. And who are we to judge people who say, we really want a child, and we want to raise a child and give it a future and so on. Now, we could always say, well, adopt one, but I mean, there's also very few children for adoption. And particularly in an aging society, and we can see the rethinking in other countries in the region where, because of falling fertility rates, assisted reproduction is becoming more and more important. Surrogacy is just another facet, controversial one, but another facet of assisted reproduction.
Yeah.
I mean, the new reports are called "Building Families Through Surrogacy," and that's a nice way of thinking about it.
Yeah, just one final question. In light of the ethos fashion that we usually do, what is the meaning of life to you?
As an avid science fiction reader, of course, the answer is 42. But other than that, it connects to what I said previously. We have a limited time on this planet. Make it count for yourself and for others.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Better than 42, I suppose.
I mean, it's supposed to say the same, but
Well, yeah, on behalf of Ethos and the HKU community, thank you very much for your time, Professor Jens Scherpe.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.